We want to get into our Advent series now, and want to talk specifically about fear. We themed this year the year of courage, where we want to learn how to be courageous in the small, medium, and large ways in our lives. And when you look at the stories of Christmas, there's one specific thing that the angel says to every single person when the angel shows up. Every single person that experiences an angel of God in the Christmas stories hears the same thing. That they consistently hear the phrase, "Do not fear." And when the angel was speaking in King James language, the angel said, "Fear not." All right? That's going to be at the heart of our series, addressing the fears that Jesus came to relieve us from. And what we will see is that when the angel shows up, it's really scary. And when God begins to work in your life and in my life, it oftentimes can be scary. Why? Because change is going to happen. And when there's change, there's often loss. And when there's loss, there's grief and sadness, or maybe even shame or regret. And all of those things activate our fears to the point where it could be a feasible scenario where you have been praying for God to do something in your life. You've been praying for him to act in your life. And once he begins to act to answer your prayer, the actual fear of change of that prayer request, the answer to the prayer might be the very thing that out of your own fear, you could sabotage it. So we want to recognize fear for what it is. We want to recognize the different ways we might experience fear. Because fear is kind of dynamic. It's almost like we are drawn to it like insects to the evening summer light bulb, right? Like we move towards it, but like Icarus, sometimes we get too close to it, right? Like we're drawn to something new, we're drawn to that adventure, we're drawn to that opportunity, but when we get to the threshold of the cost, when we get to the threshold of the loss, when we get to the threshold of the vulnerability, that oftentimes might be the very moment that draws us back. And sometimes we're drawn back because that's just the wise move. But a lot of times we pull back just because we're simply afraid. Fear is a powerful emotion. It is tremendously powerful. If you've ever experienced a maze, like a corn maze, back in the day they used to make these pretty elaborate and particularly effective corn mazes, and I thought they were pretty cool. And it is really cool. And you go there, except when your child runs around the corner in a corn maze, all of a sudden that exciting thing becomes slightly existentially terrifying, right? And all of a sudden you start feeling something, and that is a feeling that none of us want to feel. It's a fear. We're going to talk about different ways we need to not be afraid. Today, we're going to talk about how to not be afraid of silence and the silence that happens in life. And my call to us is going to be looking for ways to embrace silence. Silence does several things in our lives. When things are quiet, it reveals our emotions. Oftentimes, when things get silent, is when our racing thoughts can race harder, often driven by feelings that we've never really been able to identify. But if we can lean into silence, we can learn to manage some of those emotions, manage some of those racing thoughts. And oftentimes, it'll give us the opportunity to hear what God is saying to us. And if we allow ourselves to go into that existential, chaotic fear of what God might be saying to us, clarity will then come. And I believe courage is born out of clarity. Most people, when they know exactly what they ought to do, and they know that God wants them to do it, they can do it. But it's the competing fears, the competing ideas, the competing thoughts. It's the various algorithms that are trying to keep our minds busy, that keep us from hearing God, keep us from getting a sense of clarity, to keep us from having a sense of how we need to go to move forward. And if our minds and our hearts can be distracted by all sorts of fears we're constantly limiting, then what can happen is we can just live our lives playing whack-a-mole and never move forward. When we get a sense of clarity, we end up getting a distinct moral courage. And I think more often than not, though, it's preceded by silence. Kathleen and I went through, when we were thinking about planting our church, we had sort of a season of silence where we're not exactly sure exactly what's next for us. And we just didn't talk about it. We prayed about it. And when we began the conversation again, it was clear to each of us that the next step, was planting a church. And which is like leaving your job and you don't know how it's going to go. There's all manner of fears that could be a part of it. But once we were clear, we had the courage to move forward. All right. So we're going to be looking at the different stories of when an angel shows up to meet someone in the original nativity narratives. I want to set up the background of the story. We're going to talk about the silence of a man and the silence of God. All right? To do that, I need to at least ask you a question. It's a little bit dark in here, so I'm going to take my glasses off and ask you a question. All right. How many of you went to see one of the movies, like one of the new movies this weekend? Anybody get out to see like Wicked or Gladiator? All right. Bonhoeffer, anybody? All right. Not particularly impressive. We are not rescuing Hollywood from this room. But for our family, like the Christmas movie thing is kind of a fun thing. It's kind of always been sort of a historical thing. Like there's always a big movie coming out. But more and more, it's so expensive. You're like, you know what? I don't want to just go see any movie. I need to know it's going to be really good, right? And so we kind of wait to make sure they're good. And generally speaking, that's sort of how most people are. That's why most of the big movies are part of a franchise. They almost always have a sequel with it, right? And so just let you know, from what I understand, Wicked is only part one. There's like two. So you're only going to get the first part in this movie. Gladiator 2, I didn't even know it was coming. I was really satisfied with Gladiator 1. I didn't need a Gladiator 2, but I'll still go watch it because Gladiator 1 was really good. Why do I say all this? When it comes to our story, you need to understand that our story is the beginning of the sequel. In fact, the prequel, it kind of ended weird. The Old Testament, of all these writings, and an awful lot, right? Like this much of the Bible, right, is the Old Testament. It just kind of got weird at the end. And you knew that you needed a sequel because you can't end a story that way. Let me take us to the last pages of the Old Testament. The prophet Malachi, one of the last prophets. This is how he ends the Old Testament. Remember, lots written, right? Okay. He says, he says this was going to happen. He said, see, he's speaking for God here. I will send the prophet Elijah to you, to Israel, before that great and dreadful day of the Lord comes. He will turn the hearts of the parents to their children and the hearts of the children to their parents, or else I will come and strike the land with total destruction. All right, he was doing really well there for a while, right? It was like, good, bring the parents and the kids back together. This is going to be really, really good. That feels good. I'm in for that sequel. And then he has to drop Mike with the words, total destruction. That's it. And 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, 100 years, 200 years, 300 years, 400 years, there's no prophet. And who is this random Elijah guy? Everybody knew Elijah died 400 years before this. So everyone's like, is Elijah coming back from the dead? I mean, that's a pretty, you almost always have to do a sequel in order to keep the franchise going. So is Elijah coming back from the dead? Is there going to be a new Elijah? Is there just going to be another guy named Elijah? Like, what is this all about? What scholars will say is that these are the silent years. I have a little chart that'll just kind of show the history of God speaking to his people. You see, the Old Testament is written from, say, 1400 to 400, and God's doing a variety of things in those years, and the prophets are writing those things down, and all of a sudden, total destruction is said, and the mic drops, and nothing happens. No prophet emerges among his people. And then, we're going to pick up here. In fact, let me go ahead and do that. Let me read the passage that begins the New Testament, the first event of God speaking again to his people. All right, picking up from Luke chapter 1, beginning in verse 5. In the time of Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah who belonged to the priestly division of Abijah. His wife Elizabeth was a descendant of Aaron. Both of them were righteous in the sight of God, observing all the Lord's commands and decrees blamelessly. But they were childless because Elizabeth was not able to conceive, and they were both very old. Once when Zechariah's division was on duty and he was serving as priest before God, he was chosen by lot according to the custom of the priesthood to go into the temple of the Lord and burn incense. And when the time for the burning of incense came, all the assembled worshipers were praying outside. Then an angel of the Lord appeared to him standing at the right side of the altar of incense. When Zechariah saw him, he was startled and was gripped with fear. But the angel said to him, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah. Your prayer has been heard. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you are to call him John. He will be a joy and delight to you, and many will rejoice because of his birth, for he will be great in the sight of the Lord. He is never to take wine or other fermented drink, and he will be filled with the Holy Spirit even before he is born. He will bring back many of the people of Israel to the Lord their God, and he will go on before the Lord in the spirit and power of Elijah, to turn the hearts of the parents to their children and the disobedient to the wisdom of the righteous, to make ready a people prepared for the Lord." Zechariah asked the angel, "How can I be sure of this? I'm an old man, and my wife is well along in years." The angel said to him, "I am Gabriel, and I stand in the presence of God, and I have been sent to you to speak to you and to tell you this good news. And now you will be silent and not able to speak until the day this happens, because you did not believe my words, which will come true at their appointed time." Meanwhile, the people were waiting for Zechariah and wondering why he stayed so long in the temple. When he came out, he could not speak to them. They realized he had seen a vision in the temple, for he kept making signs to them, but remained unable to speak. When his time of service was completed, he returned home. After this, his wife Elizabeth became pregnant and for 5 months remained in seclusion. "The Lord has done this for me," she said. "In these days he has shown his favor and taken away my disgrace among the people." When it comes to silence, we don't need to be afraid. When it comes to life, we do not need to be afraid. I want us to look at this in 3 ways. The first one is this: we do not need to be afraid of God's silence. Historically, in the Old Testament, God spoke through prophets. And when a prophet would come, they would speak, and then it'd be written down. And for those who were there with the prophet, they could hear God's words. For the few who could read, they could read God's word. In those days, the Spirit would speak to the prophet. Now God has sent the Spirit to dwell the hearts of every single one of his believers. And so in some ways, every single believer is a prophet. Every single one of us who has access to the scriptures, every single one of us could hear from God. We can hear from God in the silence. But it doesn't mean he isn't quiet at times. You might remember the story of David. At some point in time, the prophet Samuel came to town, and he pulled Jesse aside and said, one of your sons is going to be king. And so Jesse's like, all right, let me bring in my sons. And there comes his oldest son's tall and handsome. God says, that's not the guy. The next one, nope. Next one, nope. Next one. I went through all the sons, and they're all done. And Samuel's like, don't you have any other sons? Jesse's like, well, we got David, like he's a shepherd. And so he brings in David, and immediately God says to Samuel, this is the new king. And right then and there in Jesse's backyard, Samuel pulls out the oil and anoints David as the king and speaks for God, saying, you are going to be the next king of Israel, which was absolutely life-transforming to David. And then God gets really quiet. Now, David was anointed to be the king. The problem was there's already a king. That king's name was Saul. And for at least a couple of decades, Saul will chase down David, persecuting him, trying to kill him. And God was very quiet in those years. God revealed himself to David, but for the years he was hiding and running, he was quiet. God had a plan, and God was working things out. God was going to bring David to the throne in righteousness. David wasn't going to slay the other king. This was going to be a peaceful transfer of power as much as it could be. David was going to emerge as king righteously, but God had to work out a plan, and David had to be patient as God was silent. You remember the story of Abraham. God promised Abraham that he was going to have a child, and for 25 years God was silent as Abraham waited for the fulfillment of that promise. God's silence can feel deafening when you have obeyed him and trusted him, but you're not seeing the immediate reward. Maybe you're just waiting for a test result. And the silence of the doctor and the silence of what God says about this thing, it can be really fearful. Maybe you've been trusting God with dating, and the right person hasn't showed up. Maybe you're trusting God by choosing a more modest career based upon how you feel he has called you. And it means that you're missing out on certain things. And it means you're not exactly sure how he's going to provide for you. This is where God's silence can be difficult. It can be challenging. In the ancient Near East, around the time of Malachi, the people of God were under Persian and Mede rule, the kingdoms that came after Babylon. But along the way, Alexander the Great emerged, and the Greek Empire took hold of the Mediterranean, the entire Mediterranean world. And Alexander's vision of Greek culture going in all sorts of places led him to drive the establishment of Koine Greek as the language that would essentially be the fluent language all the way throughout the Greek Empire. And it took hold, to the point where the translation of the New Testament that I just read to you was translated from Koine Greek. When I was trained to be a pastor, I had to learn Koine Greek, what Alexander established in 350 BC. He established libraries all the way through the Greek Empire. Why? To establish Greek culture. It might not seem significant, but when Jesus showed up, there's going to need to be a literate people who could understand the prophecies and recognize that Jesus had come to fulfill them. After the Greek Empire, that didn't last too long, the Roman Empire was established. And they established the Pax Romana that moved even beyond the Mediterranean world. And they established the ancient Roman road system, so where people could move from city to city and town to town, so that when the time was just right, and Jesus came, the good news can be transmitted not just in Jerusalem and Judea, but it could get to the entire world. God seemed quiet, but he was working a plan. When Alexander was ruling over the Jews and they didn't feel like they could fully practice their faith, it seemed like God was quiet, but he was working a plan. When the Romans had conquered Jerusalem, and oftentimes it got really ugly as they were, as they defamed the temple itself, it seemed like God was silent, but he was working a plan. It might seem like God is silent in your life as well, but he is working a plan. Maybe you can repeat that after me. Repeat this after me. God may seem silent, but he is working a plan. We do not need to be afraid when he's silent. And we do also, secondly, we do not need to be afraid when he silences us. I can appreciate Zechariah. Zechariah is in the temple. Now, he is old, and back in those days, the priesthood would serve in villages. And almost like the army reserves or whatever, they'd get called up, once a year to come serve in Jerusalem for a week or two. Well, it just so happens that this was the week or two when the festival was happening, the Day of Atonement was happening. And in those days, whoever the priests were in Jerusalem, they draw lots to find out who was the one that was going to go into the Holy of Holies. Well, it just so happened to be Zechariah. He'd probably been serving as a priest 50, 60 years at this point, but finally it's his moment. And this only happened once a year, where a priest would go into the Holy of Holies, into the presence of God, where the Ark of the Covenant was, and they would present an offering there. And while he was there, that's when the angel showed up for him. And the first thing the angel says is, you don't need to be afraid. Your prayer has been answered. Now, the scholars aren't sure exactly what he was saying, but it was probably all of his prayers. His prayer for a child that he might have prayed 50, 60 years ago, that maybe he even stopped praying for. It might have been the prayers, that the ritual prayers, that a Redeemer would be sent, a Messiah would be sent, that would have also been a part of his temple service. But the angel said, look, your prayer has been answered. But Zechariah is like, dude, have you seen me and Elizabeth? Like, nobody's putting us on the cover of some sort of new child clothing catalog. We're not going to get on the website anywhere. Like, we're old. We don't make babies at this age. And the angel's like, dude, am I not an angel? Come on, man. All right, so here's what's going to happen. You're not going to talk. You're not going to talk for like a year. We're going to wait till this baby gets here, and then we'll see what happens. And if I was Zechariah, that would probably been the most merciful thing that God could have done to me. Could you imagine this experience? I know how I would have been in that situation. If I would have gone into the very temple of God and seen an angel, and this promise would have been fulfilled, I would have been a blithering idiot. I would have just been talking about it to everybody, and I've been trying to explain it, like as if I could understand it, right? I'm an external processor, so I'd have been like, well, the angel was there. Was it because of this? I would have just babbled on and on. I would have just kept talking about it. I would have become very, very annoying, and I would have made it so complicated for everybody else. And I think the angel's like, you know what, dude? And it was a gift. It was a gift to Zechariah. You've had that moment where you spoke up and were just wrong. Being silenced can be a good thing. A humbling moment, it can be a good thing for us. Maybe you said something and you wish you didn't say it, and you just know you need to back up and just get a little bit more quiet. Sometimes that happens to us in a dynamic way, and we know we need to quiet ourselves down. Sometimes we just feel it. Sometimes it's, you're a parent and you just know exactly what your child needs to hear, but because they cannot hear it, you feel silenced. And it breaks your heart. And you wish you could be heard, but you know you won't be. Sometimes you're at work and you need to take actions that's going to feel hurtful to another employee or somebody else, and you just can't explain it to them. And more words will only make the situation worse. Sometimes you've wounded another person, and you know that it's not words that are going to restore the relationship because it's trust that has been lost. You can't use words to fix what you've done. You just need to be trustworthy again. These are the moments when God silences us, and our words can't fix that which is broken. For some of us, it may be that our reputation's been tainted out there, and we can't get out there and fix it. And we have to trust God with our reputation. Part of life is being humbled by life, being silenced by life. And sometimes God directly silences us. Sometimes it's indirectly done. But we can trust God when he silences us. He silenced his own son, Jesus. The prophets said that at the cross, Jesus would be like a lamb led to the slaughter, like a sheep before his shearer is silent. Pilate and Caiaphas and all leaders in Israel were particularly curious about his silence at all the accusers that came at him. He chose silence because his words would never be really appreciated. Words were not going to fix what had broken in this world. His death was the only way that this world could be healed. But we don't need to be afraid of being silenced, because we don't need to be afraid of silence in general. I'd like to make the case for you this Advent that silence may be the best part of what could happen in your life. Silence could be a part of how God works in your life. We live in a noisy world. You got algorithms that want to do anything they can to activate your fear, because if they can activate your fear, they can keep you doom scrolling. All sorts of things want to get your attention, and the best way to get your attention is to activate your fear, to get you reactive, to get you to do whatever it takes to stop feeling it. Let me just offer just a couple ways to import silence. The thing that's worked for me for a long time is to begin my day with a time of silence where I read the scriptures, where it's just me and God, where I'm able to listen to him through the scriptures and listen to him as I pray. If you find yourself in silence and your thoughts race, oftentimes it's your emotions driving your mind to try to get your hands around something. Using a journal to write out the things you're feeling and the places your mind's going. I like to literally bullet point all the things. And what's happening is your mind is trying to put all these things together because they're afraid they're going to be forgotten. If they get written down, your mind can relax knowing that they've been documented. I like to use the outdoors during the day to get a break instead of just going to whatever the news is. And my day is almost always better when I choose a walk versus checking Twitter. I like to write down a prayer list because if I have a list of that which I'm praying through, it keeps my mind moving forward, right? Because what happens when we get silent, we just start thinking about all these things, right? But I can pray for a few moments, and then I can look down on my list and I can keep praying. It helps to structure the silence for me. having tech-free places in our homes where we can practice digital hygiene, put the phone in another space. These are the things that kind of help protect silence in our lives. And here's why. Like I said, it's in silence where we have the opportunity to maybe begin hearing from God. We didn't get to see the resolution of what happened in Zechariah's life. One of the things that I think a lot of us assume when it comes to silence is we assume coldness. We assume absence. We assume that silence will feel lonely. What do you think happened in Zechariah's life over the course of the months? The months and months that he couldn't use words. He had to think and he had to reflect. And it was in this time that in his thoughts and reflections about who God is, something started stirring in him. And instead of sort of a disbelief or detached, like, I don't know, we're kind of old. He saw God show up. He saw his wife became pregnant. He saw the birth of his son. And it was at the moment when they were dedicating their son to the Lord where his words were opened up. I want you to hear the way he describes God after having been silenced for close to a year. He said this, because of the tender mercy of our God, by which the rising sun will come to us from heaven to shine on those living in darkness and the shadow of death, to guide our feet into the path of peace. He's describing this moment in redemptive history that God is raising up their son to be the new Elijah, who will grow up to be John the Baptist, who will point the way to Jesus. He points out that's the moment in which the sun is rising on the darkness in Israel. That's going to come to full day when Jesus reveals himself, right? But in that sunrise, how does he describe God? With the phrase, tender mercies. In your silence, you can find and experience God as tender and God as merciful. For some of us, we're just afraid of this silence because we're going to feel shame. And we're going to feel like a regret or whatever that might be. But you can call out to God for his mercy and know that he is tender. I read a book a few years ago about Abraham Lincoln. And there was this moment where he was out assessing the battlefield. And you can imagine what it's like for a president who had sent a whole bunch of troops off and their lives are being lost, and he's probably thinking about the strategies and how the generals are doing and how the leadership of that battlefield is going and how it's going to affect him, how it's affecting many lives. And as he's on the battlefield, he notices some kittens. These kittens had obviously been orphaned by the battle. And he picks up the kittens and he holds them in his arms and he talks tenderly to the kittens. And he brings the kittens over to one of the colonels and he says, "Colonel, I expect you to take good care of these kittens and make sure they get enough milk in order to be able to survive and to do well." In the middle of all this bloodshed, in the middle of all this responsibility that Abraham Lincoln had, the soldiers noticed his tenderness when it came to the kittens, and it made them trust him more. God is tender that way with you as well. Yes, God is working out a plan in all of this world, but God's plan and your joy can arrive at the same place. And sometimes we can be fatalistic about God's plan. Well, God's got a plan and, whatever, right? But like with Zechariah, God answered not only his prayer for the redemption of Israel, but his prayer for a child as well. And you see in this passage that God's plan and their joy come together. but they come together in a particular space in his time. And in silence, we can learn to trust his timing when it comes to bringing his plan and our joy together. In many ways, it's the heart of Advent, trusting that God's plan and our joy can and will come together. We can trust him for it, but it will be in his time. Let's pray.